Henry Maxwell had spent his entire life cultivating the legacy of his family's vineyard. Nestled in the rolling hills of California's wine country, the vineyard was not just a business to him, it was a monument to generations of dedication and hard work. His father had taught him the art of winemaking, and his grandfather had planted the first vines during the Great Depression, using the land to pull his family out of poverty. For Henry, this vineyard wasn't just a plot of land, it was his entire world, a living testament to his family's perseverance. The morning it all began seemed like any other. Henry woke at dawn, as usual, brewed a strong pot of coffee, and stepped outside onto the wraparound porch of his modest farmhouse. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of dew-soaked grape beans. The sight of the vineyard stretching across the valley brought him a familiar sense of peace. For years, Henry had kept the land healthy and productive, making it one of the most sought-after wineries in the region. After finishing his coffee, Henry climbed into his old pickup truck and drove out into the rows of vines. This was part of his daily routine, checking for signs of pests, monitoring soil conditions, and assessing the progress of the grapes. The harvest was still months away, but every small decision Henry made now would influence the quality of the wine. However, as he turned a corner toward the eastern side of the vineyard, something unusual caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a mirage or perhaps a neighbor's equipment that had been misplaced. Then the reality of the scene hit him like a punch to the gut. Large construction vehicles were parked haphazardly near the heart of his vineyard. Workers in hard hats were unloading materials, and a massive steel frame was being erected where his prized Zinfandel vines should have been. Slamming on the brakes, Henry jumped out of the truck and stormed toward the scene. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice echoing across the rows of grapevines. One of the workers, a young man with a clipboard, barely glanced at him. "We're just doing our job," he said dismissively. "Your job?" On my property, Henry's anger boiled over as he gestured toward the vineyard. "This land belongs to me, and no one informed me about any kind of construction here. You're trespassing." The worker finally looked up, but his expression was indifferent. "We've got the permits," he said, holding up a thick stack of papers. "You'll have to take it up with management." Henry snatched the documents from the worker's hands and flipped through them. The paperwork claimed that the construction had been authorized by a local association that, according to the fine print, had jurisdiction over properties in the area. At first, the legal jargon made little sense to him. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold: his own signature at the bottom of one of the documents, authorizing the construction of what the papers described as a community workshop. It was a forgery. Henry felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew every inch of this vineyard, and he knew his rights. His land had never been part of any association, and he certainly hadn't signed anything giving them permission to build. Who had forged his name and why? "You've got no right to be here," Henry barked, shoving the papers back into the worker's hands. "Stop all of this now, or I'll call the police." The worker shrugged, clearly unfazed. "Not my call, buddy. Talk to the foreman." Henry's frustration deepened as he scanned the area, looking for someone in charge. That's when he noticed a sleek black SUV parked just beyond the construction site. Leaning against the vehicle was a sharply dressed man in his 50s, wearing sunglasses and a smug grin. As Henry approached, the man straightened and extended a hand. "Mr. Maxwell, I presume? I'm James Carter, the project manager for this site. What can I do for you today?" Henry ignored the handshake. "You can explain to me why you're tearing up my vineyard without my permission." Carter tilted his head, as if Henry's outrage amused him. "Mr. Maxwell, I assure you, everything we're doing here is completely above board. We've got the permits, as I'm sure you've seen, and the land was approved for development months ago." "This land isn't approved for anything," Henry snapped. "I didn't sign any permits, and I sure as hell didn't agree to any of this." Carter's smile didn't waver. "If that's the case, then I'd recommend you consult with your legal team. I'm sure they can clarify the situation for you." Henry clenched his fists, resisting the urge to punch the man. "You listen to me. If you don't stop this construction right now, I'll bring every cop, lawyer, and journalist I can find down here, and I'll bury you in lawsuits. Do you understand me?" Carter's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he recovered quickly. "You're welcome to do whatever you feel is necessary, Mr. Maxwell, but I should warn you delaying this project would be unwise." Henry's heart pounded as Carter climbed back into the SUV and drove off, leaving him seething in the middle of the vineyard. He had no idea who this man was or how he had managed to initiate construction on private property, but one thing was clear: Henry was facing more than just a legal battle. This was a coordinated attack on his livelihood, and if he didn't act fast, he could lose everything his family had worked so hard to build. Standing amidst the chaos, Henry took a deep breath and made a silent vow whoever was behind this, they had picked the wrong man to mess with. Henry Maxwell barely slept that night. The vineyard that had always brought him peace now seemed like a battlefield. His mind raced with questions and possibilities. Who had the power to forge his signature? Why was this happening now? And most importantly, how could he stop it? By dawn, he was already back at his desk, sorting through deeds, contracts, and legal documents tied to the vineyard. Every page confirmed what he already knew: his property was never part of any association or development zone. The forgery was blatant, and whoever was behind it clearly believed they could get away with it. By mid-morning, Henry had contacted his lawyer, Mark Cunningham, a sharp and no-nonsense attorney who had handled the Maxwell family's legal matters for years. Mark listened intently as Henry explained the situation, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "They forged my signature," Mark Henry said, pacing the room. "They're building some monstrosity right in the middle of my vines, and they think they can get away with it because of a stack of fake paperwork." Mark's tone was calm but firm. "Slow down, Henry. Let's not give them the upper hand by acting out of anger. First, we need to document everything. Take photos of the construction site, get a copy of those forged permits, and find out exactly who filed them. If there's fraud involved, we'll expose it." Henry grabbed his camera and headed back to the vineyard, where the construction had only intensified. Workers were now pouring concrete for the foundation, and the skeleton of a massive structure loomed over the rows of vines. The sight made his stomach churn. He walked briskly to the foreman, demanding a copy of the permits. "I'm not authorized to hand over anything," the foreman replied, his tone dismissive. "Talk to the office." Henry gritted his teeth but didn't argue. He knew better than to make a scene that could later be twisted against him. Instead, he photographed everything: the construction equipment, the workers, the steel beams cutting through the vineyard's horizon. As he did, a realization struck him: the construction wasn't just damaging his vines, it was ruining the delicate ecosystem of the land. A trench dug near the structure was dangerously close to an underground irrigation system that had been in place for decades. Returning to his house, Henry uploaded the photos and sent them to Mark. Minutes later, his phone rang. "These pictures are damning," Mark said. "That trench they're digging, it looks like it's for drainage or piping, which means they might be violating environmental regulations. We'll need an inspector to confirm, but this could give us leverage." Henry was about to respond when he noticed a black SUV idling near the edge of his property. His jaw tightened as he recognized James Carter, the project manager who had smugly dismissed his concerns the day before. Carter was leaning against the vehicle, talking on his phone, but his eyes were fixed on Henry's house. Henry stormed outside, his pulse quickening. He approached the SUV, but Carter got back in and drove off before Henry could confront him. The move felt deliberate, like a taunt, and it only fueled Henry's determination. Over the next few days, Henry and Mark worked tirelessly. They filed a preliminary injunction to halt construction, citing unauthorized use of private property and potential environmental violations. Mark also contacted a local environmental agency, hoping to expedite an inspection of the site. Meanwhile, Henry continued to dig into the association's records, trying to understand how they had managed to file permits for land they didn't own. The first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. One of Henry's neighbors, an elderly man named Walter, stopped by the vineyard after noticing the construction. Walter was a retired surveyor and had lived in the area for over 40 years. Henry Walter said, leaning on his cane, "I've seen this kind of thing before. They're probably banking on you not having the resources to fight them. A few years ago, they tried something similar with a plot of land near the river. claimed it was part of their jurisdiction even though it wasn't. "What happened?" Henry asked. Walter shook his head. The owner couldn't afford a long legal battle, so they gave in. Lost their land. But you're smarter than that. Don't let them scare you. Walter's words reinforced what Henry already knew. This wasn't just about his vineyard. It was about greed and power. Whoever was behind the construction didn't expect him to fight back, but that was their mistake. The next day, Henry received a call from Mark. "Bad news," Mark began. "The injunction was denied. The judge wants more evidence before they'll consider stopping the construction." Henry felt a wave of frustration. More evidence? What about the forged signature? The environmental damage? The signature is a big deal, but we'll need a handwriting expert to testify, and that takes time. As for the environmental angle, the inspector can't come out until next week. Until then, they're free to keep building. Henry clenched his fists, his mind racing. If the construction continued unchecked, it could destroy his vines and the irrigation system entirely. He needed to find another way to slow them down. That evening, as he walked through the vineyard, Henry noticed something peculiar. The trench near the construction site had filled with water from the irrigation system, creating a small flood. The workers were scrambling to fix it, using pumps to clear the water, but their equipment wasn't designed to handle such a volume. It was a small victory, but it gave Henry an idea. He spent the next day inspecting the irrigation system, documenting every potential point of impact from the construction. He discovered that one of the pipes had already been damaged, causing water to leak into the trench. It wasn't enough to stop the project, but it was enough to prove that the construction was actively harming his property. Henry sent the new evidence to Mark, who immediately filed another motion, this time focusing on the damage to the irrigation system. "This might do the trick," Mark said. "If we can prove they're causing immediate harm, the court will have to intervene." As the days passed, Henry noticed other signs that the project was more than it seemed. Trucks arrived late at night, delivering equipment that didn't match the plans for a community workshop. The workers avoided eye contact when he was nearby, and Carter's visits became more frequent, though he never approached Henry directly. It was clear that whatever was being built, it wasn't just a workshop. Finally, the environmental inspector arrived, and what he found was worse than Henry had imagined. The trench wasn't just for drainage, it was part of a larger system designed to divert water from the vineyard. If completed, it would leave Henry's vines dry, effectively killing his ability to produce wine. "This isn't just a zoning issue," the inspector told Henry. "This is sabotage." Armed with the inspector's report, Mark filed an emergency motion to stop the construction. The case was gaining traction, but Henry knew the fight was far from over. Whoever was behind this wasn't just targeting his land, they were trying to destroy his legacy. And Henry would do whatever it took to stop them. The sound of heavy machinery had become a constant presence on Henry's vineyard. Every morning he woke to the grinding of gears and the pounding of hammers, each blow driving his frustration deeper. The injunction Mark filed had been denied, and the court's decision left Henry in limbo. He knew the system could be slow, but time wasn't a luxury he had. Each day the construction grew closer to completion, and the damage to his land became more irreversible. Despite the setback, Henry wasn't willing to let the situation spiral out of control. If the legal system couldn't act quickly enough, he needed to find other ways to slow the project down. He started his day early, walking the perimeter of the construction site, documenting every crack in the soil, every fallen vine, every piece of debris the workers left behind. The growing mound of evidence wasn't enough to stop the construction outright, but Henry hoped it would add weight to his case. Midway through his rounds, Henry spotted another trench being dug at the far edge of his vineyard. He approached the workers and demanded to know what they were doing. "This is part of the drainage system," one of the men replied without looking up from his work. "Drainage system," Henry's voice rose. "You're draining water that my vines need to survive. You're killing my crop." The man shrugged. "Not my call. Talk to the project manager." Henry's anger flared, but he kept his composure. Storming onto the site and starting a shouting match wouldn't stop the machines. Instead, he called Mark, who suggested hiring an independent contractor to evaluate the damage to the irrigation system. That afternoon, Henry contacted a local hydrologist, a man named Victor Klein, who specialized in agricultural water systems. When Victor arrived, he carried an air of calm professionalism that Henry found reassuring. Victor spent the next 2 hours meticulously examining the trenches, the irrigation pipes, and the soil around the construction site. His findings were alarming. The construction crew had already severed a secondary water line, and the vibrations from the heavy equipment were beginning to destabilize the main pipeline. If the work continued, the entire system could fail within weeks. "This isn't just poor planning," Victor said, wiping dirt off his hands. "They're either reckless or deliberate. Either way, you're looking at major damage to your crop." Henry thanked Victor and sent his report to Mark immediately. This new evidence added to the mounting case, but it still didn't stop the relentless noise of the machines. That night, Henry sat on his porch, staring out at the skeleton of the workshop rising against the horizon. For the first time in weeks, he felt a pang of helplessness. His family's vineyard was being dismantled piece by piece, and the people behind it seemed untouchable. The next morning, Henry woke to find something new in the center of the construction site: a sign. Bold, blocky letters proclaimed future site of the Community Resource Center built for you. Below the text was a logo for the local zoning board, a group Henry had never had any dealings with before. That sign was a slap in the face. It wasn't just an announcement, it was a declaration that the people behind this project had no intention of slowing down. Furious, Henry drove to the zoning board's office, determined to demand answers. When he arrived, he was met with polite indifference. The receptionist barely looked up from her desk as he explained the situation. "You'll need to schedule a meeting with the director," she said, her voice monotone. "And how long will that take?" Henry snapped. "About 2 weeks, maybe 3. He's very busy." Henry clenched his jaw. "I don't have 2 weeks. My land is being destroyed right now." The receptionist shrugged, offering no further help. Henry left the office seething, but his trip wasn't entirely wasted. As he walked back to his truck, he noticed a familiar black SUV parked across the street. James Carter was leaning against it, chatting with a man Henry didn't recognize. The two of them exchanged a handshake, and Carter handed the man a thick envelope before climbing back into his vehicle. The sight filled Henry with a sinking feeling. It was clear Carter wasn't just a project manager, he was orchestrating something much larger. Henry's suspicions deepened when he returned to the vineyard and found a letter taped to his front door. It was from the zoning board, informing him that an anonymous complaint had been filed against his property for unauthorized agricultural activities. The letter was absurd. His vineyard had been in operation for decades, long before the board or its regulations existed. This was retaliation, plain and simple. Whoever filed that complaint wanted to bury him in red tape, hoping to distract him from the fight against the construction. Henry didn't take the bait. Instead, he doubled down on his efforts to protect the vineyard. He contacted every local farmer and winemaker he knew, spreading the word about what was happening. Some of them offered moral support, while others shared similar stories of bureaucratic overreach. One of the most alarming stories came from a farmer named Linda Harrington, whose orchard had been targeted by the same association 3 years earlier. They started small, Linda explained over the phone. First, it was fines for things that weren't even violations. Then they started filing complaints about my irrigation system, claiming it was contaminating groundwater. By the time I realized what was happening, they had built a road straight through my property. Henry listened intently, her words strengthening his resolve. He wasn't going to let his vineyard become another casualty. With Mark's help, he filed a formal complaint against the association, accusing them of fraud and property damage. He also submitted Victor's report to the court, hoping it would finally force the judge to reconsider the injunction. But just as Henry began to feel a glimmer of hope, the situation escalated again. Late one night, he was woken by the sound of machinery. Stepping onto his porch, he saw lights illuminating the construction site. The workers were digging deeper trenches, ignoring the irrigation system entirely. Henry grabbed his camera and began filming, documenting the damage in real time. The next day, he confronted the foreman, demanding to know why they were working outside of permitted hours. The foreman simply shrugged. "We're on a tight schedule," he said. "Gotta make up for lost time." Henry didn't believe him. This wasn't about the schedule, it was about pushing him to his breaking point. The trenches were now so deep they resembled the foundation for an entirely different type of structure. The final straw came when Henry found one of his prized vines uprooted and discarded near the construction site. It wasn't an accident, someone had deliberately removed it to make room for the growing trench. That vine had been planted by his grandfather nearly a century ago. Seeing it lying in the dirt, broken and abandoned, felt like a personal attack. Henry took the vine back to his house and placed it on his desk. It served as a painful reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't just about protecting his land, it was about preserving his family's legacy. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. That evening, Mark called with promising news. "The judge agreed to hear our motion again," he said. "The environmental damage might be enough to get the injunction this time." Henry exhaled, feeling a flicker of relief. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a chance. Henry sat at his desk late into the night, staring at the uprooted vine that now rested in a clay pot near the window. It was a symbol of everything that had been taken from him: the family tradition, the decades of care, the irreplaceable foundation of his vineyard. The project's relentless march had not only damaged his land, but now felt like a personal assault on his heritage. Yet the glimmer of hope from Mark's update earlier in the day gave him a renewed determination. The judge's decision to rehear the motion for an injunction meant there was still a chance to halt the destruction, even if it was only temporary. For Henry, temporary was enough to buy time to dig deeper, rally more support, and expose the truth. The next morning, Henry returned to the construction site, documenting everything with his camera. Overnight, the workers had made alarming progress. The trench now cut through a critical section of his irrigation network, and the steel skeleton of the workshop had grown taller, casting long shadows over the vineyard. Even more unsettling was the presence of new equipment, massive industrial generators, and what appeared to be reinforced concrete slabs. Henry knew these weren't materials for a simple community workshop. Whatever the true purpose of the project, it was far more ambitious than Carter had let on. As Henry filmed, a voice called out from behind him. "Mr. Maxwell, you seem to have a habit of showing up uninvited." Henry turned to see James Carter striding toward him, flanked by two men in suits. Carter's smirk was as infuriating as ever, but the presence of his entourage added a new layer of intimidation. "This is my property," Henry said firmly, lowering his camera but keeping it in hand. "You're the ones who are uninvited." Carter gestured toward the construction site with exaggerated casualness. "As I've explained before, everything here is legal and above board. You're wasting your time trying to fight this." Henry took a step closer, his anger barely contained. "Legal? You forged my signature, damaged my irrigation system, and uprooted vines that have been here for nearly a century. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I'm going to make sure everyone finds out about it." Carter's expression darkened, and for the first time his confidence seemed to waver. But instead of responding, he turned to one of the men beside him, who handed him a folder. Carter opened it, pulled out a document, and held it up for Henry to see. "This, Mr. Maxwell, is a notice of compliance from the zoning board. They've reviewed your complaints and determined that the project does not violate any regulations." Henry snatched the document and scanned it. The language was dense and filled with legal jargon, but one thing stood out: the compliance notice had been issued just 2 days earlier, well after the environmental damage had been documented. It was a blatant attempt to retroactively justify their actions. "This doesn't mean anything," Henry said, tossing the paper back at Carter. "You're just trying to cover your tracks." Carter smiled again, but there was an edge of irritation in his voice. "Believe what you want, Mr. Maxwell. But I'd suggest you stop wasting your time with pointless complaints. Focus on what's left of your vineyard instead." With that, he turned and walked away, his entourage following close behind. Henry felt his hands trembling with rage as he watched them leave. The zoning board's sudden involvement raised new questions. How far did Carter's influence reach? Were they actively complicit, or simply being manipulated. Either way, it was clear that the fight was escalating. Henry needed to act quickly before the project reached a point of no return. That afternoon, Mark called with another update. "We've got the hearing scheduled for next week," he said. "The environmental report is strong, but we'll need more to sway the judge. Do you have any additional evidence of deliberate damage?" "I do," Henry replied. "They've torn up another section of the irrigation system, and the trench is getting dangerously close to my main water line. I've documented everything, but I'm not sure it's enough." Mark was silent for a moment before speaking again. "Then we need to hit them where it hurts. If we can prove that this project isn't what they claim it is, we might have a chance to shut it down entirely." "How do we do that?" Henry asked. "There's a paper trail somewhere," Mark said. "Permits, contracts, financial records, something that shows what they're really building. If we can get our hands on it, we can blow this wide open." Henry considered his options. Carter's organization was too careful to leave incriminating documents lying around, but there had to be vulnerabilities somewhere. Then he remembered the trench. If the construction was more extensive than the permits described, the workers themselves might unintentionally reveal the truth. That evening, Henry returned to the site under the cover of darkness. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, he made his way to the trench, careful to avoid the workers' makeshift security patrols. The generators hummed loudly, masking the sound of his footsteps as he climbed down into the excavation. At the bottom, he found more than he'd expected, not just pipes and wiring, but reinforced foundations extending far beyond the footprint of the workshop. This wasn't just a building, it was the foundation for a large-scale industrial facility. Henry took dozens of photos, capturing every detail of the trench and its contents. As he worked, he noticed a stack of blueprints partially concealed under a tarp. He flipped through them quickly, his pulse racing. The diagrams confirmed his suspicions the community workshop was a cover for something far more substantial. The plans outlined additional structures, including storage tanks and underground chambers. Whatever this was, it wasn't meant for the benefit of the local community. Before he could examine the blueprints further, Henry heard voices approaching. He quickly covered the plans and scrambled out of the trench, ducking behind a stack of construction materials just as two workers appeared. They were arguing about the schedule, their conversation confirming what Henry already suspected. "Carter wants the foundation done by the end of the week," one of them said. "You think he's worried about the lawsuit?" "Not a chance," the other replied. "He's got the zoning board in his pocket." "Maxwell's screwed, whether he knows it or not." The words sent a chill through Henry. He waited until the workers moved on before making his way back to the house, his mind racing. Carter's confidence came from more than just forged permits, it was rooted in systemic corruption. The zoning board's sudden compliance notice, the dismissive attitude of the local authorities, and the accelerated construction all pointed to a coordinated effort to push the project through before anyone could stop it. Henry shared the photos and his account of the trench with Mark the next morning. "This changes everything," Mark said. "If we can tie those plans to Carter, we can prove fraud and possibly even criminal intent. I'll file a motion to expand the case immediately." The days leading up to the hearing were a whirlwind of preparation. Henry worked closely with Mark, compiling evidence and preparing statements. The tension was palpable, but for the first time in weeks, Henry felt like he had a fighting chance. The discovery of the blueprints had shifted the momentum, turning the spotlight onto Carter and his organization. As the hearing approached, Henry steeled himself for what was to come. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew one thing with absolute certainty: Carter had underestimated him, and that mistake would cost him dearly. Henry Maxwell sat in the packed courtroom, his hands tightly gripping the edge of the table in front of him. The hearing was finally underway, and the atmosphere buzzed with tension. His lawyer, Mark Cunningham, had delivered a compelling opening statement outlining the environmental damage, forged documents, and mounting evidence that the construction project on Henry's Vineyard was not only illegal but potentially criminal. Across the room, James Carter sat with his own team of attorneys, his smug demeanor unshaken. For Carter, this was just another day of wielding power and influence to bulldoze over anyone in his way. For Henry, It was a fight for his family's legacy. The judge listened intently as Mark presented the photos of the damaged irrigation system, the environmental inspector's report, and the blueprint fragments Henry had retrieved from the construction site. As Mark laid out the case, Henry could see cracks beginning to form in Carter's confidence. His attorneys whispered furiously among themselves, clearly caught off guard by the level of detail and evidence Mark had assembled. But Carter wasn't about to let the tide turn without a fight. When his lead attorney took the floor, he argued that the project was not only legal but beneficial to the community. He dismissed the environmental damage as minor and claimed that the blueprints Henry had discovered were outdated drafts unrelated to the current construction. This workshop, the attorney said with practiced sincerity, is a resource for the entire region. Any delays will harm local residents who are counting on its completion. Henry clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to shout. Every word was a lie, but Carter's legal team delivered it with polished precision. The judge, to Henry's dismay, seemed unmoved by Mark's arguments or Carter's bluster. Instead, she called for a recess, stating that she needed more time to review the evidence before issuing a decision. As the courtroom emptied, Mark turned to Henry. "They're stalling," he said quietly. "Carter's team knows they're on thin ice, but if they can delay this long enough, they'll finish the construction before we can stop them." Henry nodded grimly. "We need to find something that forces their hand, something they can't explain away." Later that evening, Henry returned to his vineyard, the uncertainty of the day weighing heavily on him. The construction continued unabated, with floodlights illuminating the site as workers labored into the night. The skeletal frame of the workshop now loomed ominously over the vines, a stark reminder of how far the project had progressed. Henry felt a surge of frustration. The courtroom battle had bought him time, but it wasn't enough. Determined to take action, Henry walked the perimeter of the construction site, looking for anything he might have missed. As he neared the trench where he'd found the blueprints, he noticed something new: a series of large steel containers stacked near the edge of the site. Each was marked with a hazardous material symbol. Henry's stomach tightened. Whatever Carter was building, it wasn't a workshop. Henry photographed the containers and sent the images to Mark, who responded almost immediately. "This changes everything," Mark said over the phone. "If those containers hold hazardous materials, they're violating state and federal regulations. We need to find out what's inside." The next morning, Mark filed an emergency motion, citing the presence of the containers and the potential for environmental contamination. The motion requested an immediate halt to construction and a full inspection of the site by state environmental authorities. Carter's attorneys fired back, calling the motion baseless and accusing Henry of harassment. The legal back and forth escalated quickly, but Henry noticed something strange: the construction site had gone quiet. The heavy machinery was still, and the workers were nowhere to be seen. It was as if Carter's team had vanished overnight. At first, Henry thought the emergency motion had scared them into stopping, but when he approached the site, he realized the truth was far more sinister. The steel containers were gone. So were the blueprints, the equipment, and anything else that might have incriminated Carter's organization. All that remained were the partially constructed walls of the workshop and the trenches that scarred the vineyard. Henry's frustration boiled over. Carter wasn't just fighting the case in court, he was actively covering his tracks, erasing evidence before anyone could hold him accountable. Henry called Mark, who was just as outraged. "This is a textbook cover-up," Mark said. "But the fact that they're scrambling like this means they're feeling the pressure. We need to keep pushing." Days passed with little progress. The emergency motion was still under review, and Carter's team was doing everything possible to stall the process. Then, late one night, Henry was woken by the sound of an engine rumbling in the distance. He looked out the window and saw headlights moving through the vineyard. Grabbing a flashlight, Henry hurried outside. He reached the edge of the vineyard just in time to see a large truck pulling away from the construction site. As it disappeared into the darkness, Henry noticed something glinting in the moonlight near the trench. He approached cautiously, his flashlight illuminating what appeared to be a pile of scrap metal. But it wasn't just scrap metal. Among the debris were fragments of the steel containers that had been removed days earlier. Henry's breath caught as he noticed a faint chemical odor in the air. The containers hadn't been relocated, they'd been dumped and hastily concealed. Henry immediately called Mark, who urged him to stay away from the site until authorities could investigate. The next morning, Mark filed another motion, this time requesting a forensic investigation of the debris. The motion was granted, and within hours, state environmental inspectors arrived at the vineyard. The inspectors worked methodically, collecting samples and documenting the scene. Their preliminary findings were damning traces of industrial solvents and other hazardous chemicals were present in the soil, confirming Henry's worst fears. The contamination posed a serious risk to the vineyard's ecosystem and potentially to the surrounding area. When the findings were presented in court, Carter's attorneys scrambled to defend their client. They claimed the chemicals had been planted as part of a smear campaign against the project. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the judge finally issued a temporary injunction, halting all construction until the investigation was complete. It was a significant victory, but Henry knew the fight wasn't over. Carter's organization still had resources and influence, and they would undoubtedly find new ways to delay or undermine the case. As Henry stood in the now silent vineyard, he felt a mix of relief and resolve. The battle had taken a toll on him, but he wasn't about to back down. For the first time in weeks, Henry allowed himself to hope. The injunction gave him the breathing room he needed to repair some of the damage to his land and prepare for the next phase of the fight. Carter might have underestimated him once, but Henry was determined to ensure that mistake would be Carter's last. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, the heavy sound of her gavel cutting through the air like a thunderclap. Henry sat at the plaintiff's table with Mark beside him, the weight of weeks of tension pressing down on his shoulders. This hearing was the culmination of everything they'd fought for, a chance to not just halt the illegal construction, but to expose the full extent of Carter's deceit and the corruption that had facilitated it. Across the room, James Carter looked as calm and collected as ever, but his confidence seemed thinner now, like a veneer that could crack under enough pressure. Mark began the proceedings with a sharp, meticulously crafted argument. The findings from the state environmental inspectors were front and center. The hazardous chemicals dumped in the trenches were not only illegal but posed a significant threat to the soil, water supply, and the surrounding community. The evidence was irrefutable, backed by photographs, soil samples, and expert testimony. Mark then presented the forged signature on the permits, along with a forensic handwriting analysis confirming it was not Henry's. "This is not a case of negligence or miscommunication," Mark said, his voice firm. "This is a calculated attempt to exploit Mr. Maxwell's land, disregard state environmental laws, and destroy a family legacy in the pursuit of profit. James Carter and his organization have not only trampled on my client's rights but have jeopardized the safety and livelihood of this entire region." The judge nodded, her expression impassive but focused. Henry felt a flicker of hope. Carter's attorney rose next, his tone polished and confident as he tried to spin the situation in their favor. "Your Honor," he began, "while we acknowledge that mistakes may have been made during the construction process, there is no evidence to suggest that my client acted with malicious intent. The alleged contamination is still under investigation. And the permits, though questioned, were issued in accordance with zoning board guidelines. This project was always intended to benefit the community." Henry's fists clenched under the table. It was the same rehearsed defense they'd used all along, deflecting blame while trying to paint themselves as benevolent contributors to society. But Mark wasn't done. "If I may, Your Honor," Mark interjected, standing again. "I'd like to introduce additional evidence that we obtained during the course of this case." He handed a thick folder to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. "These are internal emails and financial records from Mr. Carter's organization, which were subpoenaed earlier this week. They detail payments made to members of the local zoning board, as well as instructions to fast-track the approval process for the project. Bypassing standard environmental reviews." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Henry watched as Carter's expression finally changed, his confident smirk replaced with a look of genuine concern. The judge called for order, and as the room quieted, she began flipping through the documents. "This evidence shows," Mark continued, that Mr. Carter not only knew about the environmental risks associated with this project but actively sought to conceal them. The payments to the zoning board officials, combined with the forged documents and the illegal dumping of hazardous chemicals, paint a clear picture of deliberate fraud and criminal negligence. Henry held his breath as the judge looked up, her eyes sharp and piercing. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone icy, "do you have any response to these allegations?" Carter's attorney scrambled to respond, but his words rang hollow. He claimed the payments were routine contributions, the emails were taken out of context, and the environmental damage was exaggerated. But the judge wasn't buying it. By the end of the hearing, the judge issued her decision. Construction on the site was permanently halted, the permits were declared invalid, and the workshop was ordered to be demolished immediately. Additionally, Carter's organization was fined heavily for the environmental damage, and an independent investigation into the zoning board was launched. As the gavel fell, Henry felt a wave of relief wash over him. But the victory didn't end there. In the following weeks, demolition crews arrived to tear down the partially constructed workshop. Henry stood at the edge of the vineyard, watching as the walls came down and the machinery that had scarred his land was hauled away. The site was bittersweet. His vines were still damaged, his irrigation system still fractured, but knowing the project was finally over gave him a sense of closure. The court also awarded Henry substantial financial compensation, not only for the damage to his property but for the emotional toll the ordeal had taken. It wasn't enough to erase the harm completely, but it was a start. With the money, Henry began restoring the vineyard, replanting the sections that had been destroyed and repairing the irrigation system. In the months that followed, the investigation into Carter's organization uncovered an extensive web of corruption. Several zoning board officials resigned in disgrace, and Carter himself faced criminal charges for fraud and environmental violations. His empire began to crumble, and the once powerful man who had dismissed Henry as an obstacle was now the one fighting to stay afloat. Standing among his newly planted vines one crisp morning, Henry looked out at the land his family had worked so hard to preserve. The scars of the battle were still visible, but so was the resilience of the vineyard. It would take time to fully recover, but Henry knew that as long as he kept fighting, the vineyard would endure just as it always had. The sun rose over Henry Maxwell's vineyard, casting a warm golden light over the newly planted vines. For the first time in months, the sound of heavy machinery was gone, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. The chaos that had invaded his land, his life, and his legacy was finally over. The workshop was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble carted off by demolition crews, and the land beneath it had been carefully leveled and treated to begin its slow recovery. Henry walked the rows of his vineyard, a cup of coffee in hand. The scars left by the construction were still visible, the uneven patches of earth, the faint chemical odor that lingered in some areas, but the new vines were taking root, their delicate green shoots reaching skyward. It would be years before this part of the vineyard was fully productive again, but Henry knew that the land was resilient, just like the family who had nurtured it for generations. The compensation awarded by the court had been substantial, more than Henry had dared to hope for. It wasn't just enough to repair the damage, it allowed him to invest in upgrades he had long dreamed of. A state-of-the-art irrigation system was already being installed, replacing the old network that had been damaged by the construction. New equipment for pruning, harvesting, and processing grapes was ordered, ensuring that the vineyard would remain competitive in an increasingly modern industry. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the new legal protections Henry had secured for his land. With Mark's help, he had worked with local environmental groups and lawmakers to designate the vineyard as part of a conservation zone. This status meant that no future developments could be approved without extensive oversight, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. Henry's fight had inspired others in the community as well. Neighboring farmers, who had initially been hesitant to get involved, were now rallying to protect their own properties from similar threats. Together, they formed a coalition, pooling resources to monitor local zoning practices and push back against overreach. Henry had become an unofficial leader in this effort, his quiet determination earning the respect and trust of those around him. One afternoon, As Henry sat on the porch reviewing plans for the next planting season, a car pulled into the driveway. Mark stepped out, a rare smile on his usually stoic face. "Thought I'd come by and see how the old place is holding up," he said. Henry poured them each a glass of wine, one of the last bottles produced before the ordeal began. As they toasted, Mark raised his glass. "To persistence," he said, "and to making people like Carter think twice before trying to pull something like this again." Henry chuckled. "To persistence," he echoed, taking a sip. The vineyard wasn't the same as it had been before, and it never would be. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The fight had strengthened Henry's resolve, deepened his connection to the land, and reminded him of the importance of standing up for what mattered most. As he watched the sun set over the rows of vines, their leaves glowing amber in the fading light, he felt a quiet sense of pride. His vineyard, his family's legacy, had survived, and it would continue to thrive for generations to come.